The polished lights of the studio gleamed over the sleek, modern set of the Morning Spotlight, one of the most watched morning shows in the country. The kind of show that stayed on in the background of suburban homes, where families sipped their coffee and scrolled mindlessly on their phones. In the center of it all sat Claire Adams, the host. Her sharp features and commanding presence made her both admired and feared in the industry. Claire had built her reputation on ruthless interviews, disarming politicians, grilling Hollywood A-listers, and throwing curveballs at CEOs who walked into the studio thinking they were about to enjoy a friendly chat. Today's guest was Andrew King, the founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies, a leading company in the AI sector. Andrew wasn't just a success story, he was the face of a new era. His company had redefined industries, revolutionized healthcare, law enforcement, finance, and more. The impact of his innovations was felt worldwide. But it wasn't just Andrew's success that had sparked buzz around this interview. No, it was something more subtle, something unspoken. Andrew King was Black, one of the very few CEOs of a major tech company who wasn't white. In a field traditionally dominated by white men, that fact alone made him a target for criticism, whether overt or hidden. It was the unspoken backdrop to the conversation, one that even the most well-meaning observers couldn't ignore. Andrew sat in his chair, calm and collected, wearing a crisp black suit that contrasted sharply with his relaxed, confident demeanor. There was no sign of nervousness, no fidgeting, no anxious glance. This wasn't his first time on national TV, nor his first time dealing with tough questions. He had been to boardrooms where the stakes were higher than this, where men in power didn't hide their discomfort at the idea of a Black man holding a place at the table. Across from him, Claire crossed her legs, offering her signature smile, a polite and warm one on the surface, but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass if you paid close enough attention. She turned to the camera as the red light blinked on, signaling the start of the live broadcast. "Good morning, everyone. We have a fascinating conversation ahead," Claire began, her voice smooth and practiced. "Our guest today is a man who has built one of the most influential companies of our time, shaping the way we interact with artificial intelligence, but with power comes responsibility and controversy." She locked eyes with Andrew. "Mr. King, thank you for being here." Andrew gave a slight nod. "Thank you for having me." Claire's smile widened, just enough to reveal a hint of calculation. "Let's dive right in. You've had an incredible rise, one many have called unprecedented. Some wonder, though, does this success speak to your merit, or is it more about a system trying to correct past wrongs?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications. It was a challenge, designed not to be answered but to provoke. Andrew exhaled slowly, already sensing the game Claire was playing. But he wasn't worried. He had already won the moment he walked into the studio. The audience, however, wasn't prepared for what was coming next. Andrew remained expressionless, giving nothing away. He didn't need to. He knew the stakes, and they weren't as high as others might think. This wasn't about his company or its achievements. This was about something much deeper, something they weren't ready for. "Interesting way to phrase that," Andrew said smoothly, his voice even. "Are you asking if I earned my success or if it was handed to me?" Claire gave a short, practiced laugh, one designed to make him feel foolish for even entertaining the idea. "Oh, not at all, Andrew. I'm simply saying that we live in a time where diversity initiatives are being prioritized. It's a good thing, of course. But some people, including our viewers, might wonder, do these programs tilt the playing field in a way that benefits some more than others?" A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience, a tension building beneath the surface. Claire's smile remained, but it had tightened, just enough for Andrew to notice. He didn't flinch. "Well," Andrew began, his tone still calm, "let's break that down." He tilted his head slightly, as though pondering her words. "You're suggesting that companies making an effort to include historically excluded talent somehow undermines merit. But if that were true, why is it that when I walk into a room full of CEOs, I'm still the only one who looks like me?" Claire paused, her composure faltering for just a moment. Her signature smile remained, but her eyes betrayed her unease. She wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not by a guest on her own show. But she quickly recovered, leaning forward slightly as she prepared for her next move. "It's a complicated issue," she began, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of defensiveness. Of course, diversity in the workplace is important, but it's also true that many people, our viewers included, might feel that some diversity initiatives could favor certain individuals over others, perhaps even over more qualified candidates. The tension in the studio became palpable. The audience could feel it, their collective attention locked onto the exchange unfolding before them. Claire's words hung in the air, and Andrew's calm response was a quiet storm waiting to break. Andrew didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head again, considering her words. Then he responded, his tone even but with a sharpness that couldn't be ignored. "Is it really that complicated?" he asked, his voice laced with mild disbelief. "Because it sounds pretty simple to me. What's actually happening here is that for the first time, people who have always been qualified are finally getting their shot. But when someone like me rises to the top, suddenly people ask, 'Did the system give you a handout?'" A single clap echoed from the audience, almost like an involuntary response, quickly stifled by the murmurs that followed. The studio was still, almost too still. Claire could feel the shift. The audience was no longer on her side. She took a slow breath, trying to regain her footing. The camera zoomed in, catching every detail of her reaction. "You're suggesting that diversity initiatives give people like you an unfair advantage," Claire said, though her words now sounded more like a challenge than a statement. "But what do you say to people who believe that these programs sometimes elevate people who might not be as qualified as others?" Andrew didn't hesitate. "If you want to talk about qualifications," he began, his voice still steady, "let's talk about the fact that I had to outperform my competition 10 times over to even get noticed. I had to build a company from the ground up, from nothing. And when I walked into meetings with investors, I was often mistaken for the assistant. They assumed that a man like me couldn't possibly be the CEO. So no, I didn't get a leg up. What I got was every challenge imaginable." The silence that followed was heavy. Claire shifted in her seat, her grip on the cue cards tightening. She wasn't used to being on the defensive like this, especially not on her own show. The studio lights seemed to grow brighter, the air more oppressive. She opened her mouth, but Andrew continued, cutting her off with a smooth confidence that made her words feel irrelevant. "You see," he said, his voice now soft but carrying an edge, "when someone like me succeeds, people question my merit. But when a white CEO takes the reins, no one asks if they really deserve their position. No one wonders if the system gave them a handout or helped them get ahead. They just assume that they earned it." Claire's expression wavered, just slightly. She wasn't expecting this line of questioning. For the first time, her composure slipped, just a little. Andrew didn't push any further, but he didn't need to. The studio had already shifted, and the camera caught every minute detail of her unease. He leaned back, crossing his legs, allowing the tension to settle between them. "Why is it," Andrew continued, his tone almost conversational, "that when someone who looks like me succeeds, people suddenly want to question if I really earned it? But when someone who looks like you succeeds, it's just assumed they belong." Claire's lips parted, but no words came out. She was losing control of the conversation, and everyone in the room could feel it. She could hear the faint murmurs of the audience, the subtle shift in energy as they leaned in, hanging on Andrew's every word. Andrew was playing the game in a way Claire wasn't used to, and for the first time, she wasn't sure how to respond. Claire's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, trying to regain control of the conversation. She wasn't going to let Andrew's calm confidence unsettle her. She had been in the industry too long, dealt with too many difficult guests, to be caught off guard by a single challenge. "Well," Claire began, her voice now colder, more measured, "I think we're getting a bit off track. Let's refocus on your company, Andrew. No one is questioning your abilities or your talent. You've built something remarkable with Nexus Technologies, and that deserves recognition." Andrew tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating her words. He could see what she was doing. She was trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But he wasn't done yet. He had been playing by his own rules from the start, and he wasn't going to let her dictate the terms now. "Actually," Andrew interjected smoothly, "I think we are exactly on track. You didn't bring me here to talk about my company, Claire. You didn't invite me on your show to discuss the innovations we're making in AI or how Nexus is changing industries. No, you brought me here to ask if I truly deserve to be in the position I'm in. That's what this is about, isn't it? Claire's lips pressed together, and she quickly glanced at the cue cards in front of her, clearly searching for a way to regain the upper hand. But Andrew's words had struck home, and she knew it. The conversation had turned from a casual interview to something far more personal, far more uncomfortable. She let out a forced laugh, trying to mask the tension in the air. Well, Andrew, that's a bit of a stretch, don't you think? I've just been asking the tough questions. We all know that success in business comes with hard work, but sometimes there are factors at play that can't be ignored. Andrew's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the studio felt as though it had gone completely still. He wasn't going to let her get away with the rhetoric. He had already heard these arguments before, and he knew exactly how to dismantle them. You're right about one thing, he said, his voice low and deliberate. Success in business does come with hard work. But here's the thing, when someone like me rises to the top, people don't ask about the sacrifices I made or the nights I spent building my company from scratch. They don't ask how many hours I've put in or how many times I've faced rejection and failure. No, they ask if I was handed something. They ask if the system gave me an unfair advantage. Claire's posture stiffened as Andrew's words landed with precision. She could feel the weight of his argument in the air, and for the first time in the conversation, she was no longer in control. A single clap echoed through the room again, followed by more. It was soft, but it was there, and it was growing. Claire's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she quickly regained her composure, trying to redirect the conversation once more. Well, she said, her voice now tinged with irritation, I don't think anyone is questioning your intelligence or your talent, Andrew. But you have to acknowledge that diversity hiring initiatives have changed the way companies operate. And some people feel that those initiatives may sometimes prioritize diversity over qualifications. Andrew didn't flinch. His response was measured, yet it cut through her words like a knife. And I'll ask you this, Claire, he said, leaning forward slightly. When was the last time someone asked a white CEO if they really earned their position? When was the last time a Fortune 500 company hired a white man and someone turned around and said, well, maybe he didn't earn it. Maybe he's just here because of the system. Claire's eyes widened, and the audience's murmur grew louder. It wasn't just the tension in the room that was building. It was the palpable realization that this conversation was about to shift in a way they hadn't expected. Andrew's voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. You know what I had to do to get here, Claire? He asked. I had to work harder than anyone else. I had to prove myself in ways that no one else ever had to. And I had to do it all while knowing that if I failed, it wouldn't just be me failing. It would be a statement that people like me don't belong in this space. He paused, letting the silence stretch. The weight of his words was unmistakable. And that, he continued, is something I have to live with every day. The studio was still, every eye locked on Andrew. Claire's grip on her cue cards tightened, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't. The conversation had turned, and there was no going back now. The silence in the studio grew heavier, more suffocating. Claire's face had lost its usual composure, her calm, practiced demeanor slipping as Andrew's words continued to hang in the air. She shifted in her seat, but there was no regaining control. The conversation had already left her behind, and she knew it. I think we're getting a little off track here, Claire said, her voice now cold and tight. She was grasping at straws, trying to redirect the conversation to safer territory. I think we can all agree that these conversations are nuanced, and that no one is denying your hard work. But Andrew cut her off with a calm precision. Are we really getting off track? He asked. His tone was smooth, but it carried an edge. Because it seems to me that we're finally on the right track. The tension in the room had evolved into something sharper now, a razor-thin tension that could cut through the air. Claire's carefully constructed persona, the one that had worked for years to make her one of the most respected hosts in the industry, was unraveling before her eyes. And no amount of smooth talking was going to fix it now. Andrew sat back in his chair, completely at ease, watching her struggle. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that this moment was about more than just a simple interview. It was about confronting the deeply ingrained biases that Claire and so many others had been trying to ignore. You know, Andrew said, his voice taking on a slightly more conversational tone. If we're going to talk about the idea of lowering the bar, then let's raise it right here, right now. The studio fell completely silent. The words landed with a heavy thud, and for a moment, no one dared to move. Claire blinked, caught off guard by the sudden challenge. She had been expecting a back and forth, a heated debate, but this was different. Andrew continued, leaning forward slightly, his gaze fixed firmly on Claire. You said earlier that diversity initiatives might be giving opportunities to people who don't deserve them. But let's look at the numbers, Claire. He gestured with one hand, measuring every word. Right now, there are exactly 6 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500, out of 500 companies. That's just over 1%. Now tell me, if the bar was truly being lowered to make room for people like me, wouldn't those numbers look a little different? Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Andrew didn't give her a chance. He kept going, relentless, his words sharp and controlled. You know what I had to do to get here, Claire? I had to build a company from nothing. I had to convince investors who looked at me and assumed I was the assistant, not the CEO. I had to outperform my competition every single day because I knew that if I failed, I wouldn't just be seen as Andrew King failing. I'd be seen as proof that people like me don't belong in this space. The silence in the room was deafening. The studio lights felt even brighter now, as if they were shining directly on Claire's growing discomfort. The weight of Andrew's words was impossible to ignore, and for the first time in the interview, Claire could feel the eyes of the audience on her. Not as a host, but as a woman who had underestimated her guest. Andrew didn't seem to care about the applause or the recognition. He wasn't playing for the cameras. His words weren't meant to entertain or provoke. They were meant to expose something deeper, something that Claire wasn't prepared to face. And yet, he said almost conversationally, there are executives at the top of billion-dollar companies right now who got there because their fathers made a few phone calls. No one questions whether they belong, do they? No one asks if they got their position because the system helped them. But when someone like me succeeds, we suddenly have to have this conversation about merit. Claire could feel the room shifting. The conversation was no longer about her or Andrew. It was about something much bigger. The carefully constructed narratives that had been allowed to persist for years were being called into question, and there was no escaping it. Why is that? Andrew asked, his voice almost a whisper now, but the room could hear every word. Why is it that when someone like me succeeds, we suddenly have to analyze why I'm here? But when someone like you succeeds, it's just expected? Claire swallowed hard, but her usual confidence had completely vanished. She could feel the weight of Andrew's words pressing down on her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't know how to respond. The studio was silent, the tension almost unbearable. Claire sat frozen in her chair, trying to collect her thoughts, but Andrew had already won the battle. His words had landed with such force that she couldn't ignore them. She had come into this interview prepared for a battle of wits, expecting to control the conversation. Instead, she had walked straight into Andrew's trap, and the audience knew it. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed and composed. He wasn't gloating. He didn't need to. His words had already done the work. He had dismantled her questions, exposed the biases in her rhetoric, and left her with nothing to say. For the first time in her career, Claire felt like she was out of her depth. She forced a smile, trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was thin and tight. Well, Andrew, she said, her voice softening just a little, I think we can all agree that these kinds of conversations are complicated. No one is saying you haven't worked hard. Andrew interrupted, his voice calm and final. Except that's exactly what you're saying, Claire. You didn't bring me here to talk about my company, about the technology we're building, or how it's changing the world. You brought me here to ask if I truly earned my place, and that's the problem. There was no fighting back this time. Claire's smile faltered, and the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about Andrew King's rise to the top. It was about the systemic issues that had been perpetuated for decades. Issues that Claire, like so many others, had turned a blind eye to. And you know what, Claire? Andrew continued, his tone never rising, but carrying an undeniable weight. I've spent my entire career proving myself to people who started 10 steps ahead of me. but I'm not doing it for their validation. I'm doing it because I refuse to let the next generation of people who look like me grow up thinking they have to apologize for their own success. A slow murmur of approval rippled through the audience, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. The camera caught a few members of the crew nodding, as if they too had been moved by Andrew's words. It was a subtle shift, but it was clear. The audience had chosen their side, and it wasn't Claire's. As the interview came to a close, Claire tried one last time to steer the conversation. "Well, Andrew," she said, her voice forced, "I think we can all agree that these conversations are necessary, even if they're uncomfortable." But Andrew wasn't listening. He was already standing, adjusting his suit jacket with practiced ease. He wasn't here to placate her or the audience. He had said everything he needed to say, and now it was time to move on. He extended his hand to Claire, his smile still intact, but there was no warmth behind it. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice cool but polite. "It's been enlightening." Claire shook his hand, her grip tight, her smile still frozen. But Andrew wasn't looking at her anymore. His attention was elsewhere, and he had already won the room. The moment the interview ended, the studio lights dimmed, and Claire quickly turned away, muttering something about appreciating the conversation. But it was clear she was already retreating. She knew the battle had been lost, and there was no recovering from this. Meanwhile, Andrew stepped off the set, his movements calm and deliberate. His phone buzzed nonstop in his pocket. By the time he reached the green room, his assistant, Ben, was already waiting, his eyes wide with excitement. "You saw it?" Ben asked, practically bouncing in place. "It's everywhere. You're trending. # Andrew King. This is huge." Andrew didn't smile or show any excitement. He simply nodded, scrolling through his phone. "I knew it would be," he said quietly. As they walked down the hallway, Ben continued to scroll through his phone, muttering about the explosion on social media. "Sterling Exposed is trending too. And lower the bar. It's going viral. People are calling it the best takedown in TV history." Andrew's expression remained neutral. He didn't care for the viral fame or the attention, but he couldn't help but acknowledge that this moment, this conversation, was bigger than just one interview. By the time they reached the car, Andrew's inbox was filled with new opportunities, interview requests, speaking engagements, and offers from major media outlets. People weren't just praising his performance, they were clamoring to hear more from him. This wasn't just a viral moment, it was the beginning of something much larger. Meanwhile, Claire was facing a different reality. Her phone was buzzing too, but not with the kind of messages she wanted to receive. Her team was already scrambling to do damage control. Articles were being written, clips were circulating, and the hashtag # Sterling Exposed was gaining momentum. The full, unedited interview was uploaded on the Morning Spotlight's official YouTube channel. Within hours, it was the most watched video, with millions of views pouring in. Corporate sponsors began to back away, and media executives were starting to question her future as a host. The world was watching, and Claire was no longer in control of the narrative. For Andrew, this was a victory, not just over Claire, but over the system that had worked against people like him for so long. He knew the fight wasn't over, but this moment, this conversation, was a powerful step toward changing the narrative. And as he glanced at the screen one last time, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again.